The Secret of the Ninth Planet by Donald Wollheim. The Mysterious Ninth World. While the circumnavigation of the solar system seems far-fetched, it may not be once the problem of effective anti-gravitational control is solved. In this book, I have assumed that the many researchers now actually at work on this problem will achieve such a result in the next decade. It is not at all impossible that they may, for we all know that the more minds that work at a problem, the sooner it will be solved. The discovery of a means of negating, reversing, or otherwise utilizing the immense force of gravitation for spaceflight purposes is now thought to be within the bounds of probability. It should occur sometime within the next 100 years, possibly in even the short period I assume here. Once solved, the severe handicaps imposed on space exploration by the weight and chemical limitations of rockets will no longer apply. The whole timetable of our conquest of the planets in our solar system would be tremendously speeded up, from hot Mercury all the way out to frigid Pluto. In describing the visits of the spaceship Magellan to the planets, I have endeavored to adhere to known facts and the more reasonable assumptions about each of these worlds. The planet Pluto, however, deserves further comment, occupying as it does both an important role in this adventure and a unique one in actual astronomical lore. Back at the dawn of this century, many astronomers, and notably Dr. Percival Lowell, studied certain irregularities in the orbit and motion of Neptune, at that time believed to be the outermost planet. They decided that these eccentricities, or perturbations as they are called, could only be caused by the presence of another, yet undiscovered planet beyond Neptune. Following this line of research, a young astronomer, Dr. Clyde Tombaugh, working at Lowell's own observatory, was able to announce on March 13, 1930, that he had finally found this ninth world, which he named Pluto. In the years that have followed, Pluto has proven to be a truly puzzling planet. Unlike its neighbors from Jupiter outward, it is not a giant world, light and gaseous in nature. Instead, it belongs physically to the small, dense inner planets, of which Earth is one. The latest viewpoint on this planet, whose size and weight seems quite like those of Earth, is that it may not be a true child of the sun, but an outsider, captured as it roamed the trackless realms of galactic space. Its orbit is highly eccentric and rather lopsided, taking it as far away from the sun as 4.5 billion miles and as close to the sun as 2.75 billion miles, thereby cutting inside the orbit of Neptune itself. In fact, during the period from 1969 to 2009, covering most of the lifetimes of the younger readers of this book, Pluto will not be the ninth planet, but the eighth, for it will be at its closest in those years. Huge Neptune will thus reign temporarily the title of being the sun's farthest outpost. This orbital eccentricity has led some astronomers to speculate on the possibilities that Pluto may once have been briefly held as a satellite of Neptune. And following that line of thought, the possibility also has been suggested that Neptune's larger moon, Triton, may once have been a companion of Pluto, which failed to break away from Neptune's grip. I think that the first men to land on Pluto are going to make some very astonishing discoveries, but I am also sure that they will never go there in rockets. They will have to make the immense trip by some more powerful means, like the anti-gravitational drive. End of The Mysterious Ninth World. Chapter 1. Special Delivery by Guided Missile. On the morning that the theft of the solar system's sunlight began, Burl Denning woke up in his sleeping bag in the Andes, feeling again the exhilaration of the keen, rarefied mountain air. He glanced at the still sleeping forms of his father and the other members of the Denning expedition, and sat up, enjoying the first rays of the early morning. The llamas were already awake, moving restlessly back and forth on their padded feet, waiting for their tender to arise and unleash them. The mules were standing patiently as ever, staring quietly into the distant misty panorama of the mountains. It was, thought Burl, a dim day, but this he supposed was due to the earliness of the morning. As the sun rose, it would rapidly bring the temperatures up, and its unshielded rays would force them to cover up as they climbed along the high mountain passes. The sky was cloudless as usual. Burl assumed that the dimness was due to volcanic dust or some unseen high cloud far away. And indeed, as the expedition came to life and the day began in earnest, nobody paid any attention to the fact that the sun was not quite so warm as it should have been. The Denning expedition, questing among the untracked and forgotten byways of the lost Inca ruins in the vast, jagged mountains of inland Peru, were not alone in failing to notice the subtle channeling away of the sun's warmth and brilliance. They were, in this respect, one with virtually the entire population of the earth. In New York, in San Francisco, in Philadelphia, and Kansas City, people going about their day's chores simply assumed that there must be clouds somewhere, the temperature only slightly less than normal for a July day. A few men shaded their eyes and looked about, noticing that the heat was not so intense, and thought it a blessing. In some places in Europe there were clouds and a little rain, and the dimness was ascribed to this. It was raining in much of Asia, and there were scattered afternoon showers throughout Latin America, which were standard for the season. There was a flurry of snow in Melbourne, and a cold blow in Santiago de Chile. The men in the weather bureaus noted on their day's charts that temperatures were a few degrees lower than had been predicted, but that was nothing unusual. Weather was still not entirely predictable, even with the advances of meteorology that were to be expected of the latter years of the 20th century. The world was reading about other things than the vagaries of the weather. In the United States, baseball occupied the headlines, and the non-athletic minded could find some speculative interest in the completion of another manned space platform racing along in its eternal orbit 12,000 miles away from Earth's surface. The U.S. moon base in the center of the crater of Ptolemaeus had described the appearance of this platform in an interesting radio dispatch which appeared on the first pages of most newspapers. The third prober rocket sent to Venus had been unreported for the 10th day after penetrating the clouds that hid that planet's surface from human eyes. It was, like its two predecessors, a minimum-size unmanned instrument device designed to penetrate the clouds and radio back data on the nature of the Vesuvian atmosphere and the surface. But after its first report, nothing more had been heard. Some discussion was going on in science circles about what had happened. Speculation centered on the possible success of other types of prober rockets, but it was universally agreed that the time had not come when a manned rocket could safely undertake the difficult trip to Venus and return. The years of space flight since the orbiting of Sputnik 1 back in 1957 had produced many fascinating results, but they had also brought a realization of the many problems that surrounded the use of rockets for space flight. It was generally believed that no one should risk a manned flight until absolutely everything possible that could be learned by robot and radio-controlled missiles had been learned. It now looked as if Venus and Mars trips were still a dozen years away. Burl Denning was keenly interested in all of this. As a senior in high school, the newly expanding frontiers of the universe represented something special to his generation. It would be men of his own age who would eventually man those first full-scale expeditions to neighbor worlds. By the time he was out of college with an engineering degree, he might himself hope to be among those adventurers of space. Burl was torn between two interests. Archaeology was both a profession and a hobby in the Denning family. His grandfather had been among the first to explore the jungle ruins of Indochina. His father, although a businessman and industrial engineer, made annual vacation pilgrimages to the ruins of the old Indian civilizations of the Americas. Burl had been with him once before, when they had trekked through the chicle forests of Guatemala in search of a lost Mayan city. And now they were again on a quest, this time for the long-forgotten treasure of the Incas. Burl was thoroughly familiar with the techniques of tracking down the ancient records of mankind. He got along well with the natives and primitive people. He knew the arts of wilderness survival. He knew the delicate techniques of sifting sand and dirt to turn up those priceless bits of pottery and chipped stone that could supply pages of the forgotten epics of human history. However, later in the day it seemed as if their particular camp had petered out. There were ruins there, a broken-down wall, a dry well, a bit of eroded bas-relief lying on its side. Burl's father looked at him thoughtfully. The tall, sandy-haired youth was sitting astraddle a pile of dust, methodically sifting it through a wide mesh strainer. A large pile of sifted sand gave evidence of the length of his efforts, and one broken bit of clay was the only result he had obtained. Two of the Indian guides sat patiently in the shade watching them. One was digging slowly, turning up more dirt to be sifted. "I think we've had enough here," said the elder Denning. "Burl, you can knock off. Tomorrow we'll pull up stakes and see what is in the next valley. We'll try to follow that old Inca road over the mountains. I don't believe anyone has ever penetrated there, and the airplane surveys indicate some evidence of human dwellings." Burl nodded and set the sifter down. He learned to curb his natural energies for the exacting tasks required of serious scientific research. "Okay," he said. "I was hoping you'd move on soon, Dad. This looked like a washout from the first. I'd say this place was sacked and ruined even before the Incas fell." The old man nodded. "I suppose so. Well, let's wash up and see what's for supper." They went down to the icy mountain stream to wash the dirt from their hands. "It's been a nice day," Burl commented. In spite of the sun being out steadily, it wasn't hot at all. Cooler than yesterday. Mark Denning looked up at the sky and the sun lowering toward the horizon. "There must have been some volcanic dust in the heavens," he said. "The sun's been a bit dimmed. Have you noticed?" Burl squinted his eyes against the glare. "Wasn't any eruption around here. Maybe in Ecuador?" His father shrugged. "Could have been thousands of miles away," was his slow reply. "Volcanic dust travels around the world, just as radioactive dust permeated the atmosphere from atomic testings. They say that the dust from the great Krakatoa explosion remained in the atmosphere for 3 years before the last of it settled." When they had finished supper and the sun was casting its last red rays over the rapidly purpling landscape, Burl got out the expedition radio, set up its antenna, plugged in its compact atomic battery, and tried to get the news from Lima. All he got was static. He fiddled with the dials for a long time, twisting the antenna, ranging the wavelengths, but there was static everywhere. "Strange," he said to his father. "Something's disturbed reception completely." Pedro Gonzalez, their official Peruvian guide, leaned over. "Could be the battery she has broken, eh?" Burl shook his head. "Not this battery," he said. "It's a brand new one, a real keen development. And I already checked the wiring. It's some sort of disturbance that's blocking reception. Maybe we're in a dead zone or something." "Wasn't dead yesterday," said his father. "Maybe that eruption was radioactive." Burl looked up sharply. "I'll check the Geiger counters, Dad. Something's blocking reception, something strong and powerful to interfere with this set. But when he returned, he had to admit he had found nothing. When the sun went down they retired, for the temperature dropped swiftly in the high, thin air of the Andes. In the rest of the world, people watched their color vision shows without interruption. Reception was good with the moon base. The space platforms had no difficulty making reports, and the radio news beamed out as usual. In Lima, there was a little static, and direct transmission with Brazil seemed partially disrupted, but that was all. In the following 5 days, the Denning expedition had managed a difficult climb over the next range of mountains and had come down in the high plateau valley between. In the same period, the world began to realize that the dimness of the sky was not a temporary phenomenon. Weather stations noted that the past few days had all been several degrees under the average. Reports had come in that farmers were querying the unusual drop in the temperatures at night, and astronomers, measuring the surface heat of the sun, came up with strange discrepancies from previous data. One astronomer communicated with another, and a general exchange of advice began. In a short while, a communication was laid on the desk of the President of the United States, who scanned it and had it immediately transmitted to the Secretary General of the United Nations. The Secretary General circulated the report among the scientific bureaus of all member nations, and this led in turn to a meeting of the Security Council. This meeting was held in quiet, without benefit of newspaper reporters or audience. There was no longer any doubt. The radiation of the sun reaching the face of the earth had decreased. The facts were indisputable. Where a day should have registered, in some places, at least 90 degrees in the sun, a reading of only 84 degrees was noted. Measurements definitely showed that the face of the sun visible to man on earth had dimmed by just that margin. This might not prove serious at first, but as the scientists called in by the Security Council pointed out, it promised terrible things as the year went on. A difference of 5 or 10 degrees all over the earth could mean the ruin of certain crops. It could mean an increase in snowfall and frost that could very rapidly destroy the economies and habitability of many places on the earth's teeming surface. But what, asked the chairman of the council, is causing this decrease in solar energy? This the astronomers could not answer, but they pointed to one factor. The reports from the U.S. moon base did not agree with the observations from Earth. Moon instruments claimed no decrease whatsoever in the amount of sunlight reaching the arid, airless surface of the Earth's only satellite. The cause was somewhere on Earth, and the Security Council requested the careful scanning of the Earth from space platforms and the Moon to determine the center of the trouble. Burl Denning had not found the next valley of much interest either. Evidence of an Inca road over the mountains had petered out. There were signs there had been human dwellings, but they were not Inca, just reminders of the one-time passage of an unknown band of primitives who had grazed their sheep, built temporary tents, and pulled up stakes, perhaps 100 years before. So again at night, Burl, his father, and Gonzales took counsel. They were debating which way to proceed next. Mark Denning reasoning that they should go further inland, following tales natives had told, Gonzales urging that they retract their path and proceed northward toward the regions where Inca ruins abounded. For the past week, Burl had not been able to get radio reception. The static had increased as they had gone eastward over the mountain, but not a word of news or any human voice came through. The moon was rising on the horizon as Burl sat playing with the antenna. Finally, he gave up and switched it off. The discussion had died away and the three men were quiet. The Indian guides had retired to their own campfire, and one of them had taken out his pipes and was blowing a soft, plaintive tune. Burl stared at the full moon in silence, wondering if he would ever have a chance to walk its surface, or if his own future lie in probing mankind's past rather than surveying the grounds of his future. As he watched, he thought he saw a faint light among the brightening stars where none had been before. He squinted, and sure enough, he saw that one tiny white light was swinging more and more toward the center of the sky. He pointed it out to his father and Gonzalez. "Too fast to be a celestial object," he said. "Is it one of the space platforms, or a Sputnik?" The two men gazed at it in curiosity. Suddenly it seemed to grow brighter and sharper and to twist toward them in its path. "Look!" gasped Burl, but the others were already on their feet. The light plunged down. There was a sudden outburst of yellow flame that caused the three to duck instinctively, and brought the Indians to their feet with yells. The glare brightened until they could see that something was just above them. The fire vanished as swiftly as it came, but a white spot of light remained. "It's a parachute!" Burl shouted. "It's a rocket or something, breaking to a stop above us and coming down by parachute." In the pale light of the full moon, they saw that something metallic and glistening hung from the white mushroom of a parachute. There was a clanging sound as it hit the rocky earth with a soft, sighing whoosh. The cloth of the parachute settled. They ran across the dry stone of the valley floor, but Burl's long, athletic legs outdistanced the others. He reached it first. It was a cylinder of metal about 3 feet long and a foot in diameter. "It's the nose of a message missile, dropped from a guided missile," Burl announced. "And look!" He dramatically pointed the beam of his flashlight upon its side. There, written in black, heat-resistant paint, were the words: "To the Denning Andes Expedition, from U.S. Air Force Base, California region, by guided missile post by Moon Base Control, Ptolemaeus Crater. Official. Open without delay." End of Chapter 1. Chapter 2. The Valley of Stolen Sunlight. For a moment all three were silent with amazement. "From California and Moon Base for us?" gasped Burl. "Finally. But why? What can they want of us?" His father frowned. "Only way to find out is to open it and see." He squatted down to study the cylinder closer. Burl pointed a finger at the nose. "Looks like a crack there. Maybe it unscrews. Let's lift it." It was not as heavy as it had appeared, for like all rocket missiles, it was made of the light but tough alloys that were necessary to conserve weight lift costs and fuel reserves. They stood it upright and tried to turn the top. After a little resistance, it unscrewed slowly. Inside they found a rolled document bearing the seal of the United States Air Force. Burl took it out and unfolded it with unsteady hands. His father read over his shoulder. Gonzalez poked at the empty cylinder impatiently. Finally he burst out, "What does it say? What do they want?" Burl turned to him. "It's unbelievable. It's just so darn surprising. The dimness of the days, the drop in temperature, it wasn't just around here. It was all over the world." Quickly he went on to tell the Peruvian what they had just learned. The communication was from the U.S. Space Commission, and it had been directed on its flight from California by the Moon Base, because only from the satellite could the exact location of the Dennings be spotted. It seemed that the Dennings were the only scientifically trained personnel close to the point on Earth where the disturbance originated. This also accounted for the blanketing of radio waves in their vicinity. Several airplanes had tried to locate them, but strange disturbances in the ether and atmosphere had made it impossible to establish contact. Also, the back reaches of the Andes were poorly mapped and treacherous in air currents, even in normal times. During the last week, a certain fraction of the sun's light and energy reaching the earth has been diverted. It has been bent or focused in much the same way that a lens bends light rays. And the point to which it has been directed is a spot only 7 miles from here, over that last mountain range, said Burl, pointing. Gonzalez followed his finger. Just over the mountains lies the source of the trouble, said Burl excitedly, and we're the nearest to it. They want us to go over there and see what it is, stop it, or report back. It took the telescopes in Moonbase to locate us and track the center of the trouble. Mark Denning pursed his lips. We'll have to start tomorrow, and we'll have to go fast. A loss of light and heat, however slight, could have very serious effects on life if continued too long. We can make it by tomorrow night if we start early and leave the Indians and pack animals behind. The other two nodded. Mark looked at them in the half-light of the moon. You'll have to stay with the equipment, Pedro. Otherwise the Indians might abandon it. Burl and I will start out at dawn. Gonzalez agreed, and the three made their way back to the camp. At the first sign of light breaking in the morning horizon, Burl and his father started off. They carried only enough equipment for survival, plus the additional items that might be needed for the emergency ahead. The trek over the mountains was a hard one, the path narrow, steep, sometimes non-existent. There were few signs of Indians or animals, and it was plain that few ever traveled over this range. The air was cold and thin, vegetation sparse and hardy. All around them was the cold blue of the sky, a shade darker than usual, and the gaunt peaks of ancient mountains. The Inca kings may have claimed the land here, but even their hardy legions had never conquered these lonely and hostile sky domains. Panting and weary with hours of climbing, Burl and his father made a quick lunch in a sheltered jumble of rocks near the top. Then, shouldering their packs again, they trudged on. At last they reached a point where the view of the other side spread out before them, a breathtakingly clear vision of the little valley below. As they looked down, the air seemed to shimmer and vibrate. Burl rubbed his eyes. "It hurts," he said. His father squinted. "There's a powerful vibrational effect. It may be a very dangerous concentration of the invisible rays of the sun as well as of light." Once Burl had gotten used to the odd visual effect, which was like gazing into the twisting heat rays rising from an overheated oven, he saw that there was a small flat region between the mountains, and in the center of this valley was a large black structure of some sort. The twisting effect of the light around it made it impossible to tell more. "That's it," said Burl. His father nodded, shifted the pack to ease his shoulders, unstrapped the hunting rifle slung over his back, and carefully checked its loads. Burl saw what his father was doing and suddenly understood the danger. What could be doing a thing like this? What but something not of this earth, something of distant space, of a science beyond that of man, and unfriendly besides. Now, for the first time, Burl realized what he had not had time to before, that this was an enemy he and his father were facing, an enemy of all mankind, and utterly unknown. He gulped, gripped his rifle, and followed his father down the sliding, rocky trail. As they drew near the base of the mountain, the effects of the strange vibrations grew more pronounced. Burl avoided looking directly ahead, keeping his eyes on the ground before his feet, yet even so he could not help noticing how the stones around them seemed to shimmer in the invisible waves. From the base of the valley the sky now seemed streaked with black and gray rings, as if they were reaching the center of some atmospheric whirlpool. Out of the mountains, after hours of arduous scrambling, they started across the barren rocky plain. Before them rose a vast circular structure several stories high, ominously black, and without any sign of windows or doors. Above the building protruded two great projections ending in huge, shining discs. One of the monstrous cup-like discs was facing the sun. The other pointed in the opposite direction. As the two men came nearer and nearer, the strangeness in the air increased. They felt they were being penetrated through and through with invisible lances with tiny prickles of heat. "Radiation?" queried Burl softly, afraid of the answer. His father trudged grimly on for a moment and then put down his pack. He took out a Geiger counter and activated it. He shook his head. "No radioactivity," he said. "Whatever this is, it isn't that." They reached the wall of the building. Oddly, here they seemed sheltered from the unusual vibrations. Burl realized that the source was above them, probably the two mighty discs raised high in the sky. The Dennings surveyed the building, but found no entrance. It must have been a quarter of a mile around its walls, but there was no sign of a door or entry. The wall was of a rock-like substance, but it was not like any rock or plastic Burl had ever seen. "We've got to get in," said Burl, as they returned to the starting point. "But how?" His father smiled. "This way." He opened his pack and took 2 cans of blasting powder from it. "I thought these would come in handy. Lucky we had some left over from the blasting we did last week." He set both cans at the base of the high wall, wired them together, and ran the wire as far as it reached. When the two men were a safe distance away, Mark sparked off the explosive. There was a thunderous roar. Rocks and dirt showered around them, and bits of black powdery stuff. When the smoke cleared, Burl and his father leaped to their feet, rifles in hand. There was a crack in the side of the wall where the explosive had gone off, and the rip was large enough to get through. Without a word, they charged across the ground, still smoking from the concussion, and squeezed through the mysterious walls of the enigmatic building. The walls were thin but hard, as befit masters of atomic engineering. Inside they found a roomless building, one single chamber within the frame of the outer walls. A dim bluish light emanated from the curving ceiling. On the uncleared rocky ground, which was the floor of the building, were a number of huge machines. They were spherical, glassy inventions, many times the height of a man, connected by strings of thick metal bars and rows of smaller globes, none of which was familiar. There was a steady humming noise, and above, the 2 giant metal masts penetrating the ceiling rotated slowly. Doubtless the great sun-trapping discs were affixed to the top of these masts. There was no living thing in sight. Burl and his father stood silently, half crouched, with rifles at the ready, but nothing moved to challenge them. There was only the humming of the sun transmitters. Burl called out, but there was no answer. They advanced cautiously, fearing a trap. The place did not have the look of living things about it. "An automatic station," said Mark under his breath. "I think it's strictly automatic." It gradually became evident that Mark was right. Everything was automatic. Whoever had built this structure to divert the rays of the sun had simply set it down, put it in motion, and left. There was no evidence of any provisions for a garrison or a director. They studied the machines, but could make nothing of them. They found what looked like controls, but although they pushed and pulled the levers and knobs, the humming did not cease. It seemed as if the controls were either dummies or had to be specially motivated. "What do we do now?" asked Burl, after they had tried pulling all the levers on one particular switchboard without any results. "Do you have enough powder left to blow up the machinery?" His father shook his head. "I had only those 2 cans with me. We could try shooting into the machinery." Leveling his rifle, he fired at a glassy globe perched upon the central sphere. The bullet pinged off it, and they saw that it had failed even to dent the glistening surface. "It won't work," said the elder Denning, after several more shots had produced the same result, and the concussion reverberating from the enclosed walls had nearly deafened them. They continued to hunt for a clue, but found none. Dejected, Burl kicked a loose pebble and watched it rattle against a column near the main control board. A small metallic ball rested on top of the column, apparently unattached. A replacement part, he thought to himself, wandering over to it. It was about the level of his head. With the thought that if he examined it he might learn something of the nature of the working machines, he reached out with both hands to pick it up. As his hands touched the metallic ball, there was a sudden terrible flash of power. He felt himself grasped by forces beyond his control, paralyzed momentarily, like one who has laid hold of an electrically charged wire. He opened his mouth to scream in agony, but he could say nothing. A great force surged through his body, radiating, charging every cell and atom of his being. He felt as if he were being lifted from the floor. Then the globe seemed to dissolve in his hands. It became a glare of light, grew misty, and then vanished. For a moment he stood there on tiptoe, arced with the potent violence of the force, glowing from within with energies, and then he felt as if the supercharge were dissolving itself, slipping into him, sliding into the ground, then disappearing. He stood before the column, swaying, but still conscious and alive. His hands were still raised, but there was no ball between them, neither of metal nor of power. He let them fall to his side and took a step. He was whole, he was sound, he was unharmed. He heard his father's footsteps running to him, and murmured weakly, "I'm all right." And he was. He could see no sign of damage. "I must have absorbed an awful lot of that energy, or whatever it was," he said. After resting a moment, he decided to try the useless controls again. Going over to one small board, he idly shoved a lever. This time he felt resistance. The lever was activated. There was a slight change in the radiance of one globe. "Dad!" Burl shouted. "It works! It works for me now!" Mark Denning watched as Burl turned dials and levers and got responses. "You must have been charged in a special way," he said excitedly. "That's how they lock their devices. They will only respond to a person carrying that special energy charge, whatever it was. Come on, let's get to the main control before the effect goes away, if it does." The two dashed to the panel which they guessed activated the main sun transmitter. Burl grabbed the instruments and threw them back to what seemed to be the zero positions. The humming rose in intensity, then quieted down and finally stopped. There was a series of clicks, and one by one the various globes, condensers, and glowing machines died out. Above them came a whirling noise, and Burl looked up to see the masts withdrawing into the building, their discs presumably left flat and directionless. It felt different. Suddenly they knew that the vibrations which had been so heavy in the air above them were gone. There was silence everywhere, the natural silence of an empty, lifeless building in an uninhabited valley. Burl and his father made their way to the break in the wall and climbed through it. Outside, the sun shone down brighter than it had before. The sky was the calm, serene blue of a cloudless day. Burl knew that at the same moment, all over the world, the sky was clearer and the sun warmer. But for how long? Behind them, the building still stood, and its inventors were still to be found. End of Chapter 2. Chapter 3. The Secret of AG-17. The Dennings did not have much time to speculate on the mystery of the Sun Stealers, for just as they were discussing what should be their next course of action, the problem was solved for them. There was a roaring in the air, then a humming, and in a matter of a few more seconds 6 rocket helicopters popped into sight, hovered over the valley on streaming jets, and settled down. "They're U.S. planes," gasped Burl, jumping to his feet and going to meet them. "It must mean that they know we stopped the machines." "Obviously," said his father, striding with him to greet the helmeted man who was now stepping out of the lead machine. By this time the last of the squad had landed, and the khaki-clad soldiers in them were already disembarking. "I imagine that all over the world the sky turned a little brighter. It must have been apparent at once." The leader of the copter men reached them. He was a tall, bronzed man, wearing the service coveralls and markings of a captain of the Air Force. He stretched out his hand. "You must be the Dennings. I'm Captain Saunders. I've been asked to bring you back with me right away so that we can get a complete report of this affair. How fast can you get ready?" "Why," said Burl, "we're ready right now, as soon as we can dump our packs aboard. But gee, you mean go back? Where?" Saunders smiled grimly. "To California. We just left there. I've been given urgent orders to waste no time. So will you oblige?" The two Dennings looked at each other. This was important, all right. They realized that these planes had flown on fast rockets the instant the sky had cleared. Possibly there was still a crisis, one they had not heard of. They did not pause to ask further questions. Mark Denning asked the captain to dispatch one of his copters to the camp beyond the mountains to tell Gonzalez to load up and start back for Lima. This order given, the two Dennings climbed into the rocket copter and Saunders took the controls. With a whoosh, the squat craft lifted on its rockets. Its jet-driven fans carried it up, folded, and the rocket engines took over. On upward into the stratosphere they hurtled, across the western hemisphere, across the face of jungle and isthmus, across the barren mountains of Mexico, and in a matter of less than half an hour settled down in the wide green field of a U.S. Air Force base in Southern California. It was all so swift, so sudden, that to Burl it seemed like a dream. There had been so many days in the field, in the peace and quiet of the high mountains of the Andes. There had been the slow hunting around age-worn ruins, the careful, deliberate sifting of tons of soil and sand for tiny shards. Then this, the urgent message, the trek, the weird building, the strange, body-filling shock, and the control over the sun-theft globes, followed by the swift transition over thousands of miles. Here he was in his home country, weeks sooner than he had expected, but not to return to his home and school. No, for he felt that somehow an adventure was beginning that could lead anywhere. Perhaps his adventure had actually ended, but he saw now that he would be questioned, probed, and asked to recount his story over and over. Burl and his father were met at the port by a group of officers and escorted rapidly to a room in a large building. Here there were half a dozen men in civilian clothes. One by one these men were introduced, and as each one was named, Burl wondered more about what was to come. There was a general from Army Intelligence. There was a high member of the State Department. There were 3 noted astronomers, among them the surprisingly young Russell Clyde and the elderly and famous Dr. Merkman. There was an aircraft manufacturer whose name graced 1,000 planes, and an engineer who had contributed to the conquest of the moon. The general, Walton Shrove, asked them to sit down. He was in charge of the affair. It turned out to be a careful questioning of their story. It was not a hounding of questions, as in a police quizzing, or a baiting from newspaper men eager to get a scoop. Rather, their questions were deliberate and intelligent. They drew out the full account of what Burl and his father had seen in that valley, and of what the sun-theft globes appeared to be like in operation. They concentrated deeply on the curious experience which had placed in Burl the charge that enabled him to control the machines. "Would you mind," the general asked Burl, "if we subject you to a series of medical and electronic tests to determine whether this charge is still with you?" Burl shook his head. "I'll go along with anything you say." "Very well," the general smiled. "We'll make our purposes clear to you afterward. But we want to get this over as soon as we can." Burl left the room in company with 3 technicians who had come in. They took him to the medical office at the base, and there he was given a complete check. At the electronics lab, electrodes were attached to him, and careful readings were made of the natural electrical resistance of his body and of his apparent physical charge. After an hour of tests, Burl was brought back to the main council room. As he entered, he sensed he had interrupted something important. His father looked at him, and Burl detected in his face a certain curious mingling of pride and parental concern. What, the young man wondered, were they all up to? When he was seated, the company grew silent. The general pursed his lips, looked directly at Burl, and said, "I think the time has come to acquaint you with the problem our world is facing. We may ask you to make a very personal decision, and we think you ought to know what may hang on it." He stopped. Every face at the table was grim. Mark Denning, too, was sober, though Burl detected that he also did not quite know what was to come. "It is apparent that some race of beings, some species from outer space, unknown to us, has begun a process of tapping the power and light of the sun for transmission elsewhere. The station on Earth, which you shut down, was an important one, but it was not the only one. There are others operating in this solar system." He nodded to Merkman. The old astronomer took the cue. "The observatories of the Earth, aided by the lunar observers, have definitely determined that there is still a certain amount of light being shifted from the faces of other planets and diverted. We have detected by telescopic and telethermic measurements that there are areas of sun disturbances on the surfaces of the planets Mercury and Mars. We suspect the existence of one on Venus. We believe that this may prove to be true on other planets as well, but we have no doubt of the first 2. Measurements of the amount of sun power being piped away and of the effect of the magnetic disturbances used to create and maintain these stations have shown that they will have a definite effect on the structure of the sun itself. We have not yet completed all our calculations, but the preliminary studies indicate that if this type of solar interference is not stopped, it may cause our sun to nova in somewhere between 2 and 3 years' time." He stopped, but the 30-year-old prodigy, Russell Clyde, took up the story. "By nova, we mean that the sun will literally explode. It will flame up, burst to many times its present size. Such an explosion will burn Earth to cinders, render all the planets inside the orbit of Jupiter uninhabitable, scorch their atmospheres, dissolve their waters into steam, and make them lifeless, flaming deserts. We have seen other stars turn nova. We have measured their explosions. We know just about what age and stability inside a sun is necessary to cause this, and we fear that the danger of our own sun doing so is great if the sun tapping is not stopped." Everyone at the table was silent. Burl was stunned. Finally he caught his breath. "But how can we stop it? We can't get to all the planets in time. Our rockets are not ready, and rocket ships would be too slow. Why, it would take 2 years for rocket ships to reach Mars if the expedition were ready now, and I understand that it will be another 10 years before Operation Mars is even attempted." General Shrove nodded. "That is correct. Our rocket engineering is not yet advanced enough to allow us to take such emergency action. We are still only just over the doorstep of interplanetary flight, and our enemies, whoever they may be, are obviously far advanced. But, as you will see, we are not entirely without hope. Colonel Lockhart, will you tell them about Project AG?" All eyes turned to Lockhart, who was a short, stocky man in civilian clothes. Burl realized that this man had been a colonel at one time, but remembered now that he had taken a post with one of the largest aviation companies after leaving the service. Lockhart turned cold gray eyes directly to Burl. "We have in my company's experimental grounds one virtually untested vessel which may be able to make a flight to Mars or any other planet in the time allowed. This is the craft we refer to as AG-17, the 17th such experiment, and the first one to succeed. It is powered by an entirely new method of flight, the force of anti-gravity." Burl hung breathlessly on his next words. "You probably know that work on the scientific negation of gravity has been going on since the early 1950s. It was known shortly after experiments had been conducted on atomic and subatomic particles that grounds had at last been found by means of which a counteraction to gravity might be set up. Early subatomic studies showed that such a force was not only theoretically possible, but that certain subparticles actually displayed such tendencies. On the basis of these first discoveries, work has been going on in the development of negative gravitational drive for at least 20 years. As early as 1956, there were not less than 14 such projects underway in virtually all the leading aircraft industries of the United States, not to mention the rest of the world. In the last few years, at the direction of the Air Force, these projects have been consolidated, placed under one main roof, and brought to its present status, which is, we believe, the one of final triumph." He glanced at General Shrove, who returned the glance unsmilingly. "After the successful testing of several models, a full-size craft has been built which utilizes the new method of space drive. One such craft has been built, and only one. This ship, if it works, is at this time the only means by which humanity can hope to make the trips to the other places in the solar system from which the sun stealers are working. It is with this one vessel only that we can put their sun tap stations out of commission. But I emphasize again the experimental nature of this ship. What its capacities are and how well it will work is still a matter of planning book conjecture. We can prepare the ship to take off in 1 week's time. I do not think, judging from what Merkman and Clyde have said, that we can afford to wait any longer. Another such ship cannot be built in less than a year." General Shrove spoke then. "It is already arranged that this AG-17 spaceship is going to go. A volunteer crew has been selected. Several of them are in this room." He nodded briefly to Clyde and to Lockhart. "But although these volunteers are among the best men in their fields, there isn't one of them who couldn't be replaced by someone equally skilled in the same field. But there is one person on Earth right now who may just possibly be unique. This person may hold, by virtue of an experience not shared by any other human being, a special key that will render easier the task that this spaceship must fulfill." He turned to Burl, who sat tingling with suspense. "You, Burl Denning, are apparently still carrying some sort of electronic or sub-electronic charge which is attuned to the controls of the sun tap station. We feel that you should be along on this expedition. It will be long and dangerous. It will involve landing on worlds no man has ever visited or expected to visit for hundreds of years. There is an enemy in the sky who will certainly try to stop our single ship. To be bluntly honest, the voyagers on this ship face such dangers as explorers have not faced since the days of Magellan and Cook. Its chances of return are probably remote, but with the permission of your father, which he has already given, I would like to ask that you volunteer to join its crew." Burl felt dizzy, his heart thumping painfully within his chest. He took a deep breath And then carefully, trying to keep his voice from quivering, he said, "Yes, I will go." End of chapter 3. Chapter 4. The Hidden Skyport. Around the table there was a concerted sigh. Burl, his ears still throbbing from his sudden excitement, realized each of them had been holding his breath. General Shrove smiled and glanced at the elder Denning, who sat expressionless. It was not an easy thing for him, Burl thought. At that moment, Burl knew that he had come of age. This moment of decision, coming truly and literally like a bolt out of the blue, had thrust him into man's estate before his time. He would show that he was able to carry this burden. Shrove now spoke to Lockhart. "Colonel, we are holding you to your schedule. According to it, you can take off in 5 more days. Will you need any more time because of this addition to your crew?" The stocky air veteran shook his head. "Not at all. We'll be loaded and ready on the hour I set. I'll take Denning in hand and brief him on what he may need to know. Actually, we may even be able to get him a home leave. After all, his duties won't begin until actual planet falls are made." They rose from their seats. Burl stood up, uncertain as to procedure, but Lockhart came over to him and took his arm. "Burl, we're going to have to give you a rundown on the ship and the plans. We've no time to waste, if you want to get a chance to say goodbye to your folks later on." "I understand," said Burl. He turned and waved to his father, who was in conversation with the general. "I'll see you at home in a few days, Dad," he called, then followed Lockhart out. Outside the building, they were joined by several other members of the conference and immediately ringed about by a squad of Air Force men wearing sidearms. Burl realized that they were to be thus guarded everywhere they went. Obviously, the possibility that the builders of the sun traps might have agents operating on Earth had occurred to the officers. Russell Clyde, the young astronomer, was among their group. He walked over to Burl and shoved out a hand. "Glad to have you with us, Burl. This is going to be quite a trip." Clyde was about Burl's size. He had an engagingly boyish air about him, and Burl took a liking to him. Burl had heard of him before, for the young man, while still a college student, had formulated a remarkable new theory of the composition of galactic formations which had instantly focused the attention of the scientific world upon him. This theory had been taken up by the graybeards of the scientific world and had survived the test of their debates. Now associated with the great Mount Palomar Observatory, Russell Clyde had continued to build a reputation in astronomical circles. "You're one of the expedition, then?" asked Burl, shaking his hand. The redhead nodded. "Yep. They're taking me as their chief astrogator. And don't think it's because I'm any great shakes at it, either. It's just that I'm still young enough to take the kind of shoving around these high brass figure we're going to get. Boy, have they got it figured." Burl chuckled. "Are you kidding, Dr. Clyde? You've probably been in on this from the beginning." The other shook his head vigorously. Nope. It was going to be Merkman's baby. But when they realized they'd have a fight on their hands, they always look for young blood. And say, cut out this doctor stuff. Call me Russ. We're going to share quarters, you know." "How do you know that?" asked a tall, rather sharp-featured man who had overheard them. "The colonel will assign quarters." "I say he will, and you can bet on that," snapped Russell Clyde. He waved a hand in introduction. "This is Harvey Canton, one of our electronics wizards." Canton nodded, but before he could continue the discussion, Lockhart rounded them all up, packed them into a couple station wagons, guards and all, and they were off. The next few days were hectic ones. By car and plane the group was transferred to the large, closely guarded base in Wyoming, where the secret anti-gravity ship was waiting. Burl did not see this ship right away. First he was introduced to all the other members of the crew and given a mass of papers to study, which outlined the basic means of the new space drive, and which detailed the opinions and suggestions of various experts as to the methods of procedure and courses of action. He was subjected to various space medical tests to determine his reaction under differing pressures and gravities. Although it proved a strenuous and exhausting routine, he emerged from the tests with flying colors. The expedition was commanded, as he had known, by Colonel Lockhart, who would also act as chief pilot. The famous military flyer proved to be a forceful personality with a great skill at handling people. He knew how to get the most out of each man. Russell Clyde was the chief astrogator and astronomical expert. Assisting him was the rather pedantic and sober Samuel Oberfield, a mathematical wizard and astrophysicist, on leave from an assistant professorship at one of the great universities. Clyde and Oberfield would also act as co-pilots, relieving Lockhart. Harvey Caton, blond Jurgen Detmar, and the jovial Frank Shea were the three-man engineering crew. Completing the members of the expedition was another trio chosen to act as general crew, medical, and commissary men while in flight, and as a trained explorer fighter unit while on planet side. Roy Haynes, of whose exploits in Africa and the jungles of South America Burl Denning had heard, was the first of these, a rugged, weather-beaten, but astonishingly alert explorer. Captain Edgar Bolton, on leave from the United States Marines, was the second, a man who had made an impressive record in various combat actions in his country's service. The Antarctic explorer, Leon Ferrati, completed the listing. Ferrati was an expert on getting along in conditions of extreme frigidity and hostile climates. Of these men, only Lockhart, Clyde, Detmer, and Ferrati had had space experience in the platforms and in moon rocketry. It was still, thought Burl, a large crew for a spaceship. No rocket built to date had ever been able to carry such a load. But by then he had realized that the strict weight limitations imposed by rocket fuels no longer applied to this new method of space flight. Burl found himself more and more anxious to see this wonderful craft. It was not until the morning of the second day that Burl's chance came. He had fallen asleep on the stiff army cot in the hastily improvised base on the Wyoming prairie where the final work was being done. The day had been a confused jumble of impressions, with little time to catch his breath. Now he had slept the sleep of exhaustion, only to be awakened at dawn by Lockhart. "Up and dress," the colonel greeted him. "We're taking you out to look the ship over. Detmar will come along and explain the drive." Burl threw his clothes on, gulped down breakfast in the company of the others at the mess hall, and soon was speeding along a wide new road that ran up to the mountain edging the wide western plain. As they neared the mountains, he saw a high wooden wall blocking the road and view. This was the barrier that concealed the ship nestled in the valley beyond. They passed the guard's scrutiny and emerged into the valley. The AG-17 loomed suddenly above them, and Burl's first impression was of a glistening metal fountain roaring up from the ground, gathering itself high in the sky as if to plunge down again in a rain of shining steel. The ship was like a huge, gleaming raindrop. It stood 200 feet high, the wide, rounded, blunt bulk of it high in the air, as if about to fall upward instead of downward. It tapered down to a thin, perfectly streamlined point which touched the ground. It was held upright by a great cradle of girders and beams. At various points the polished steel was broken by indentations or inset round dots that were thick portholes or indications of entry ports, Around its equator, girding the vessel's widest section, was a ring of portholes, and there were scattered rings of similar portholes below this. As the three men drew near the tail, the great bulk loomed overhead, and Burl felt as if its weight were bearing down on him as they walked beneath. Two men were suspended from the scaffolding above. Burl twisted his neck and saw that the designation AG-17 and the white star insignia of the United States had been lettered along the sides. But what was it the men were painting now? "It will read Magellan," said Lockhart, following Burl's eyes. "We decided that that would be the appropriate name for it. For what we are going to have to do with it is just not make a simple trip to explore another planet, but to circumnavigate the entire solar system." Burl found his eyes dazzled by the vessel, hanging like a giant bulbous mushroom over them. Around him, he began to realize that a number of other activities were going on. There were spidery scaffolds leading up to open ports in the metallic sides. Workmen were raising loads of material into these ports, and for an instant Burl caught sight of Haines, in rough work clothes, shouting orders from one of the openings as to exactly where to stow something. At last he took his eyes away from the startling sight. The little valley around him had a number of low storage shacks. A road led in from another pass through the mountains. Two loaded trucks came down this pass now in low gear. Lockhart, watching, remarked, "We are having our equipment and supplies flown up to a town 20 miles away, and then trucked in." "Why didn't you leave this ship where it was built, in your plant in Indiana, and load it from there?" Burl asked. "It would have been easier," said the colonel, "but security thought it better to transfer the craft to its launching site up here in these deserted hills. We are going to make our takeoff from here because we are still too experimental to know what might happen if something kicked up or if the engines failed. We'd hate to splatter all over a highly populated industrial area. Besides, you must know, if you've looked over those papers yesterday, there's a lot of radioactive stuff here." Burl nodded. Detmar cut in. "Why don't we get aboard and show him over the ship? It will be easier to make it clear that way." Suiting action to the word, the three went over to one of the loading platforms, climbed on the wiry little elevator, and were hoisted up 50 feet to the port in the side of the ship. They entered well below the vast, overhanging equatorial bulge which marked the wide end of the teardrop-shaped vessel. They walked through a narrow plastic-walled passage, broken in several places by tight, round doors bearing storage vault numbers. At the end of the passage they came to a double-walled metal airlock. They stepped through and found themselves in what was evidently the living quarters of the spaceship. The Magellan was an entirely revolutionary design as far as space vehicles were concerned. Its odd shape was no mere whimsy, but a practical model. If a better design were to be invented, it would only come out of the practical experiences of this first great flight. It had been long known, ever since Einstein's early equations, that there was a kinship between electricity, magnetism, and gravitation. In electricity and magnetism there were both negative and positive fields, manifesting themselves in the form of attraction and repulsion. These opposing characteristics were the basis for man's mastery of electrical machinery. But for gravitation, there had seemed at first no means of manipulating it. As it was to develop, this was due to two factors. First, the Earth itself possessed a gravitational phenomenon in this force outside of that intense, all-pervading field. Second, to overcome this primal force required the application of energy on such scales as could not be found outside of the mastery of nuclear energy. There was a simple parallel. Burl had been told the day before by Sam Oberfield, in the history of aviation. A practical, propeller-driven flying machine could not be constructed until a motor had been invented that was compact, light, and powerful enough to operate it. So all efforts to make such machines prior to the development of the internal combustion engine in the first days of the 20th century were doomed to failure. Likewise, in this new instance, a machine to utilize gravitation could not be built until a source of power was developed having the capacity to run it. Such power was found only in the successful harnessing of the hydrogen disintegration explosion, the H-bomb force. The first success at channeling this nuclear power in a non-bomb device had been accomplished in England in 1958. The Zeta ring generator had been perfected in the next decade. Only this source of harnessed atomic power could supply the force necessary to drive an AG ship. The nose of the Magellan housed an H-power stellar generator. Within the bulk of the top third of the ship was this massive power source, its atomic components, its uranium-hydrogen fuel, and the beam that channeled the gravitational drive. Negating gravity is not a simple matter like inventing a magic sheet of metal that cuts off the pull of the earth, such as H.G. Wells wrote about, Oberfield had explained. That is impossible, because it ignores all the other laws of nature. It forgets the power of inertia. It denies the facts of mass and density. It takes just as much energy to lift an anti-gravity ship as to lift a rocket ship. The difference is only in the practicality of the power source. A rocket ship must burn its fuel by chemical explosion in order to push its cargo load upward. Its fuel is limited by its own weight and by the awkwardness of its handling. This AG ship also must supply energy, foot-pound for foot-pound, for every foot it raises the vehicle. But due to the amount of energy supplied by this new nuclear generator, such power is at last available in one compact form and in such concentration that this ship could propel itself for hundreds of years. He went on to explain that what then happened was that the vessel, exerting a tremendous counter-gravitational force, literally pushed itself up against Earth's drive. At the same time, this force could be used to intensify the gravitational pull of some other celestial body. The vessel would begin to fall toward that other body and be repelled from the first body, Earth in this case. As every star, planet, and satellite in the universe was exerting a pull on every other one, the anti-gravity spaceship literally reached out, grasped hold of the desired gravitational rope hanging down from the sky, and pulled itself up it. It would seem to fall upward into the sky. It could increase or decrease the effect of its fall. It could fall free toward some other world, or it could force an acceleration in its fall by adding repulsion from the world it was leaving. In flight, therefore, the wide nose was the front. It would fall through space, pulled by the power beam generated from this front. The rear of the spaceship was the tapering small end. As Burl was shown over the living quarters, it became plain to him that the actual living spaces in the Magellan were inside a metal sphere hanging on gimbals below the equatorial bulge that housed the power drive. The bulk of this sphere was always well within the outer walls of the teardrop, and thus protected from radiation. Being suspended on gimbals, the sphere would rotate so that the floor of the living quarters was always downward to wherever the greatest pull of gravity might happen to be. Burl and the others explored the 3 floors that divided the inner sphere, all oriented toward Earth. The central floor, housing the sleeping quarters and living quarters, was compact but roomier than might have been expected. There were 5 bunk rooms, each shared by 2 men. There was a main living and dining room. On the lowermost floor was the cook room, a small dispensary, and immediate supplies. On the upper floor was the control room, with its charts and television viewplates, which allowed vision in all directions from sending plates fixed on the surface in various areas. In the spaces between the inner sphere and the outer shell were the basic storage areas. Here supplies and equipment were being stocked against all possible emergencies. In the tapering space of the tail below the sphere was a rocket launching tube. Stored in the outer shells were various vehicles for planetary exploration. Haines came into the control room where the three were standing. He was wiping his hands on a piece of cloth and looked tired. Finally got the special sealed engine Jeep stowed away, he said. I was afraid we weren't going to get it in time. The moon base people had ordered it, and they're going to holler bloody murder when they find out we appropriated it. Lockhart shrugged. Let 'em yell. It'll be too late when they find out. How much longer will we need before you finish the loading? Haines drew up a chair to the chart table and sat down. I expect to get some more stuff tomorrow, and then the 2-man rocket plane the next day. We already have the 4-man rocket aboard. That'll do it. The rest of your men ready? Lockhart nodded. We're just about set. Denning here can take a quick trip home tomorrow, and we'll be ready the day after. Burl looked about him quickly. 1 day, 2 days, maybe a third, and then the plunge into the unknown. Detmar reached upward and drew down a metal ladder hanging in the curved ceiling of the chamber. I'm going to take a look in the engine room, he said. Want to come along? He asked Burl. Before the young man could say yes, Lockhart shook his head. No, I don't want him to. I don't want anyone going up there who doesn't have to. That stuff is shielded, but you can never be sure. Burl was disappointed, for he had wanted to see the nuclear generators. But Detmar shook his head, smiled, and pushed aside a round trap door in the ceiling. Burl could see that it connected with a similar door a foot higher. Detmar pushed it open and ascended into the forbidden sphere of the Zeta rings. Burl got a glimpse of subdued bluish light, and then the trapdoor shut after the engineer. Later, as they drove out through the valley, Burl looked back at the huge ship, and now, instead of appearing like an overhanging metal waterfall, he saw it as a wide-nosed bullet aiming at the sky, surging against its bonds, a bullet for humanity's sake. End of Chapter 4. Chapter 5. Up the Rope of Space. Burl's visit home was a curious interlude. Actually, he had been away only a few weeks since the summer vacation had begun, yet this single day had an air about it different from that of any other homecoming. He found himself continually looking at things in a more inquisitive, more thoughtful manner. That which had been commonplace was suddenly something valuable, a sight to be treasured. For he had realized, as he sat in the fast plane transporting him home, that the earth was itself a planet among planets, and that this might possibly prove to be his last visit to the town where he had been born. He had pondered, as he had gazed out of the ship's windows, just what it could mean to depart from this world and travel among the uncharted reaches of empty and hostile space, to set foot upon planets where no human foot had ever touched, and to meet unguessable perils. So his home, his mother, his friends, the street on which he lived, took on a novel air. He studied them while enjoying a quiet day at home. He watched the cars in the street, so amusingly compact and small, each designed in the fleeting style of the year. The cars of a dozen years ago had been designed for length and size, but the trend had been the opposite for a decade now. The cars grew smaller and their lines weirder as the manufacturers strove to compete. What other planet could boast of such simultaneously astonishing ingenuity and wondrous tomfoolery? He looked at the people going about their business. the other boys of his age intent on their summer jobs and summer fun, and wondered if he would ever be able to join them again without the cares of a world on his shoulders. People were unaware of the crisis that hung over the solar system. There had been news of the dimming of the sun, but the meaning behind it had been carefully screened, and the expedition was a top secret. It availed the world nothing to panic about this matter. Now the odd weather quirks had been forgotten, and the main subjects on people's tongues were the baseball scores and the latest telemovies. When Burl kissed his mother and father good-bye, it was with a sense that he was also kissing good-bye to his youth and entering upon a new period of the most desperate responsibility. The mood lingered with him back at the base, although his companions of the trip to come seemingly did not share it. On the last day, quarters had been assigned in the Magellan, and the men moved their belongings to their tight bunks in the heart of the ship. Clyde had had his way, and he and Burl shared a double-decker chamber. There was a hustle and bustle in the valley. The supplies seemed unending, and Burl wondered why the variety. "For once, we've got lifting power to spare," was Russ's comment. "Nobody knows what we're going to need on the various planets, so Lockhart is simply piling everything aboard he can think of. You'd be amazed at the space we have for storage. And Captain says that the more we stick in there, the better the shielding is against the radiation belt surrounding Earth, and probably the other planets as well." "I thought we were already well protected," said Burl. "With the atomic generators, we had to be shielded anyway. Haven't we lead lining all around our inner sphere quarters?" Russell Clyde nodded. "Oh, sure, but the more the merrier." He and Burl were already in their quarters, stowing their clothes. "We leave in an hour," said Burl. "Are we going to the launching base at Boothia, where the manned rockets go up?" Clyde shook his head. "Lockhart talked it over with us yesterday, and we decided to take off from right here." By us, Burl knew the operational group was meant, which consisted of the colonel, the two astronomers, Caton, head of the engineering section, and Haines. "To tell the truth, nobody knows how easily this ship will handle. We're shielded well enough so that a short passage through the radiation belt 300 miles up and for the next 1,500 miles shouldn't have any effect on us at all. The rockets, which can't be shielded because of the weight limitations, have to go up at Boothia because there, at the North Magnetic Pole, there's a hole in the radiation." Boothia Peninsula was a barren spot far up in the Arctic zone on Canada's frozen eastern coast. On it was constructed the world's major spaceport, a lonely outpost from which rockets departed for the equally lonely moon bases. Burl had read about it and had looked forward to seeing it, but realized that the flight of the Magellan marked still another change in the fast-altering history of the conquest of space. The hour passed quickly. The little valley was cleared of visitors. The crew was called to take off posts. Lockhart at the controls, Clyde and Oberfield at the charts, Detmar watching the energy output. The rest of the crew had been strapped into their bunks. By special request, Burl was observing in the control room, seated in a half-reclining position like the others, in a well-padded chair, strapped tight. Haines had remarked, as he had supervised the strapping in, "Nobody knows whether this is going to be necessary, but we're taking no chances." He had gone to his quarters and done the same thing. Lockhart watched the registering of the dials in front of him, waiting for the load to build up. There was a muffled whine from overhead as the generators built up current. Detmar called out a cryptic number every few seconds, and the colonel checked it. The two astronomers were idle, watching their viewers. They'd made their calculations long before. "Time," called out the colonel, pressing a button. A gong rang throughout the quarters. He moved a lever slowly. Burl waited for the surge of pressure he had read always occurred at takeoff, but there was no such pressure. He lay back in his seat, gripping the arms. Gradually he became aware of a curious sensation. He seemed to be getting lightheaded, and to tingle with unexpected energy. He felt an impulse to giggle, and he kicked up his foot to find it surprisingly agile. About him the others were stirring in their seats, as if caught by the same impulses. Now he felt loose against his bonds, and he became a little dizzy. There was a pounding in his head as blood surged within him. His heart began to beat heavily. "We're losing weight," muttered Clyde from his chair, and Burl knew the ship was tensing to take off. The great generators were beginning to push against Earth's gravity, and as their force moved upward to match Earth's, the weight of everything in their sway decreased accordingly. Lockhart's first move was simply that, to reduce the pull of Earth to zero. In a few moments that point was accomplished. A state of weightlessness was obtained within the Magellan. Those watching outside from bunkers in the surrounding mountains saw the huge teardrop shiver and begin to rise slowly above its cradle of girders. It floated gently upward, moving slowly off as the force of Earth's centrifugal drive began to manifest itself against the metal bubble's great mass. Everyone on the crew had experienced zero gravity, either in the same tests Burl had undergone or on actual satellite flights, and thus far no one was too uncomfortable. The entire structure of the ship quivered, and Burl realized that the inner sphere which housed their airspace was hanging free on its gimbals. Lockhart rang a second gong, then turned to new control. The pitch of the generators, faintly audible to them, changed, took on a new keening. The ship seemed suddenly to jump as if something had grasped it. The feeling of weightlessness vanished momentarily. Then there was a moment of dizziness and a sudden sensation of being upside down. For a shocking instant, Burl felt himself hanging head downward from a floor which had surprisingly turned into a ceiling. He opened his mouth to shout, for he thought he was about to plunge onto the hard metal of the ceiling which now hung below him so precipitously. Then there was a whirling sensation, a sideways twisting that swung him about against the straps. As it came, the room seemed to shift. The curved base of the control room, which had been so suddenly a floor, became in a moment a wall, lopsided and eerie. Then it shifted again, and startlingly, Burl sagged back into his cushioned seat as the hemispherical room again resumed its normal aspect. Lockhart bent over the controls, cautiously moving a lever bit by bit. Clyde bent over his viewer, calling out slight corrections. Now at last Burl felt the pressure he had expected. His weight grew steadily greater, back to normal, then increased. He found himself concentrating on his breathing, forcing his lungs up against the increasing weight of his ribs. "Hold up," his buzzing eardrums heard someone say, possibly Oberfield. "We don't need to accelerate more than 1 g. Take it easy." The weight lessened instantly. Then the pressure was off. Everything seemed normal. Lockhart sat back and began to unloosen his straps. The others followed suit. In one viewer, Burl glimpsed the black of outer space, and in another, the wide grayish-green bowl of the earth spreading out below. In a third, he saw the blazing disk of the sun. "Did everything go all right?" he asked quietly of Clyde. The redhead looked up at him and smiled. "Better than we might have expected for a first flight," he said. "We're latching on to the sun's grip now. We're falling toward the sun, not just falling, but pulling ourselves faster toward it so that we can keep up a normal gravity pressure. We're soon going to be going faster than any rocket has ever gone. The living space sphere rotated itself as soon as we started that. That's what made everything seem upside down that time, and why everything has come back to normal." Burl nodded. "But that means that in relation to Earth, We ourselves are upside down right now." "Of course," said Clyde. "But in space everything is strictly relative. We are no longer on Earth. We are a separate body in space, falling through space toward the sun." "Why the sun?" asked Burl. "I thought our first objective was to be the planet Venus." "It was too hard to get a fix on Venus from so near the Earth. Instead, we've latched onto the sun to pull us inward. When we are near Venus's orbit, we'll reverse and pull in on Venus," was the astronomer's answer. "Isn't that rather risky?" asked Burl, remembering some of the quick briefings he had been given. "That's a departure from your plans." Lockhart looked up quickly. "Yes, you're right," he admitted. "But on a trip like this, we've got to learn to improvise and do it fast. We made that decision at takeoff." For an instant Burl felt a chill. He realized then what all the other men on the ship had known all along, that in this flight they were all amateurs, that everything they did was to be an improvisation in one way or another, that they must always run the risk of a terrible mistake. Had latching onto the sun been the first such error? End of chapter 5.